That sounds promising. Perhaps Andy, to start, if you would tell us a little about what you do. What's your day job, so to speak?
Yeah, so I have two halves of full-time job, or two full-time jobs, whichever way you look at it. In one half, I'm the co-director of the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, which is obviously the focus for today. And I also chair the Leeds Climate Commission. Both of these are commissions that are kind of independent bodies set up to support climate action, either in the region or in the city of Leeds. And we're also part of a wider network. There are now 20-something of these commissions around the UK, and we work with a lot of them, supporting and guiding them. And the other half of my job, as of the last month, I am the climate advisor to the UK Infrastructure Bank, which is a new body set up in Leeds, national body. It's a public bank, so it's not for profit, but its job is to invest in net zero across the country. And so I'm a few weeks into a new role in that half of my job.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Anything you want to say at this point about the commission itself and where it kind of came about, or do you want to get into the slides and take it from there?
Yeah, if I can share my screen and show some slides, that probably gives a graphic kind of image of it.
Fantastic. Looking forward to it.
Great. Let me just maximize this. You see that okay?
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay. So the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, just to give you a bit of background, we've been up and running for a little over a year. And we were set up, or we were the Yorkshire Leaders Board, which is the body that represents all of the local authorities, combined authorities and mayors across Yorkshire and Humber, asked us to set up this commission based on the Leeds Climate Commission, which has been running for 6 or 7 years now. And so we were launched last March as an independent advisory body set up to support ambitious climate action across Yorkshire and the Humber region. And we are deliberately independent. We're linked to the local governments, but not part of them by any means. And instead, we draw together climate leaders from across the public sector, including people like the NHS, the Environment Agency, Natural England, universities, schools, and so on. Also the private sector, including water companies, Yorkshire Water, some of our biggest companies, Northern Power Grid, Northern Gas Networks, and people like the CBI and the TUC. And then lastly, third sectors. So these are pressure groups like Friends of the Earth, Climate Action South Yorkshire, community energy groups, carbon literacy programme, and communities. And we think we're the largest regional commission of our kind in the UK. We have a structure. So we have a small secretariat, which I run at the University of Leeds, which has got about 4 people in it, to give you some idea of the scale of what we do. And then we have a national policy forum where we connect to regions MPs and to central government departments like the BEIS on energy and industry, transport, housing, and DEFRA on food and agriculture. We have a regional policy forum where we bring together all of the chief execs and council leaders and senior people with a responsibility for climate change in all of the 22 local and combined authorities in the area. And then we have a net zero working group, which I think what we'll talk about mainly today, which includes many of our largest energy companies and business energy consumers and banks and building societies and transport companies, and also pressure groups again. A climate resilience working group where we work with the Environment Agency and Yorkshire Water and the National Farmers Union on flooding and other climate risks, and how we're going to deal with those in the region. And then we have a communities and engagement panel, a future economy panel looking at the future of the Yorkshire economy and what climate change will mean for the economy, and the Land, Waste, Nature and Food group, and then last year, research and evidence panel. So aside from 4 or 5 people employed by the Secretariat, in theory, I work a day a week on this, in practice it's more. It's all done through volunteering, and these are kind of in-kind contributions from all the organizations that want to get involved in collaborating and shaping, the region's response to climate change. And then we have, we were also asked when we were launched to establish the Climate Action Plan in time for COP26 in Glasgow in November. So we had almost no time to do this. 4 or 5 months to write a big, ambitious climate action plan. And the remit of the action plan, like the remit of the Commission, is to foster climate resilience and adaptation to climate risks and impacts. And when you look at these for the region, then some of them are really quite terrifying, especially flood risk and coastal change around the Humber, but not only in the Humber. And then also to support rapid progress towards net zero. So carbon cutting, both on the supply side with energy and renewables, and on the demand side, looking at both individual households, but business behavior and business demand, and also looking at carbon capture, utilization and storage, especially from our large carbon intensive power sector and people like glass manufacturers and aluminium and cement and petrochemicals. We also have the goal to, I'm going to change the order of this, to protect and restore nature and biodiversity. So we're not only climate change, it's also the nature crises. And that runs through everything we do. And then lastly, to encourage a just and inclusive transition. So this one is recognizing that, some people justifiably are really worried about climate change and net zero and the impact it might have on their jobs. And similarly, some businesses that think they'll find it hard to make the transition to net zero are really worried about the impact it will have on them. And, we focus very much on the positives, like the opportunities for job creation around climate change. And that's really significant, especially for wind energy around Hull, for example. But, we also need to take people with us and to leave no one and nowhere behind. So we're very much about supporting high carbon companies, high carbon sectors, high carbon jobs and communities to enable them to make the transition in an inclusive way. So those are the 4 aims of the action plan. And then what we did is we ran multiple stakeholder engagement sessions through the summer and the autumn. And we had active involvement from over 500 people from across the region feeding into the action plan. The aim was for it to be a positive, constructive, actionable, deliverable document that will, inform practical action across the region. It includes actions for everyone in the region, but also specific actions for us as a commission. And it will be and is a living document. It's not designed to be a document left on the shelf. It's supposed to be, used on a regular basis to guide our activities. And we're already working hard on delivering aspects of it, and I can go into that a bit later. I won't go through all of these. Paul, I think we can pick up any that you're particularly interested in, but we had 3 sections in the action plan. One was around the broader kind of cross-cutting framework for change and things that we need to do to build our capacity as a region to act on climate change. And then one cluster was around resilience and adaptation. And the other was around net zero and mitigation of climate change. On the framework for change, the first point we needed to make is that all organizations need to acknowledge that climate change, that there is a climate and ecological crisis. So it's urgent and we need to act like it's an emergency. That was a key point to make. However, we also wanted to be positive and to say that acting on climate change can help us as a region to become a better place to live with, more sustainable jobs, better housing, better transport, protected nature, and so on and so on. Also that we need to commit to this idea of a just transition. and include people in the process. So to give people a say in this, so that climate change and our reaction to climate change isn't something that's done to people. People have a chance to feed into and steer the process. So, events like this, but also many, many others, are around involving people in the process. We're also developing a climate leaders pledge to get the 50 largest organizations in the region to take responsibility for climate change, to be very proactive, to work with their communities and their employees and their customers, for example, to expand the impact of climate initiatives, to raise awareness and education, to integrate this into the economy, and jobs and skills are a key part of that, to develop a financing platform, which is a part of what I do now, and to be innovative, to focus on nature-based solutions and blue-green infrastructure, especially for flood protection, but also for carbon management. And peatland management and moorland management, for example, is a massive source of carbon emissions. But if we get it right, we can, improve our resilience and reduce our susceptibility to flooding, but also, reduce our carbon emissions and improve our nature and biodiversity aspects too. And then some other aspects of this that we've already talked about a little bit, to reach out to policymakers, to engage with policymakers, and get our local and combined authorities, but also our MPs on board with this, and to get them to integrate it into everything they do. I mean, one of our key aspects is that we shouldn't have climate change as a side event or a kind of afterthought, but it should be mainstreamed into everything that happens in the region. So into our housing policy, into our transport, into our land and agriculture, and into our education and our curriculum for schools and colleges and universities, into our economic development plans, and so on. And so, a big part of our activities are around kind of mainstreaming, we call it, climate change into the heart of the major activities in the region. Would there be a good time to pause for a minute and take any thoughts or comments, or open this up for discussion?
We could do, absolutely, Andy. There's a couple in chat already. Peter, you had one about education. Do you want to share a little bit more on that?
Yes, you mentioned education. I just wondered if you've got any active plans at the moment to talk to schools as part of an outreach program.
We do, to the extent that we have a commissioner who is a lead from schools, who is connecting into various schools networks. We also have youth climate assembly representatives on the commission. And we are planning at the moment to develop a kind of program to support the integration of climate change into the curriculum in schools, but also in colleges and universities. So we haven't completed everything that we're planning to do, but there are active plans to do that. One of our problems is we don't have much resource ourselves as a commission. So we need to work with others who can then reach out to multiple other, widen the audience. And so, yeah, we need to work with, networks of schools and local authorities and trusts and academies. So rather than us engaging with lots and lots of schools, which we honestly haven't got the resource to do, us reaching out to people who can reach out to lots and lots of schools. So that's our plan in that space, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And there was a quick question from Dillis, which maybe I can relay, just the point on there about the blue-green infrastructure. If you could expand on what that is a little bit more, Andy.
Yeah, of course. Sorry to be a bit jargony in here. For me, this is one of the most exciting things that's happening in the climate world at the moment, is this recognition, or the joining together of the climate agenda with the nature and ecological biodiversity agenda. And blue-green infrastructure, the blue refers to the water management part of it. And the green, when we talk about green infrastructure, we contrast it with grey infrastructure, which is kind of concrete and steel based. So if you think of flood protection, you could respond to flood protection by, pouring lots and lots of concrete and steel and having lots of pumping stations and, grey or hard infrastructure to deal with flooding. But actually, people are getting more and more excited about blue-green or nature-based approaches to this. To give you a good example, so Hull as a city is below sea level, flooded terribly in 2007. And if the forecasts for climate change and sea level rise and more intensive extreme weather events are true, then places like Hull face a massive challenge from flooding in the future. They had a choice. They could either build a massive ring main, basically. Imagine a huge pipe, those big concrete pipes that are about 1 meter or more wide, and lay one of those around the border of Hull. And I think the proposal was to have 6 pumping stations with massive pumps in them. So when there's another flood, all the flood water could be diverted into this, storm drain and then pumped out into the Humber. Now that would have cost billions of pounds to do, I think over $1 billion to be accurate, and would have been very carbon intensive and very disruptive and would have, had a big natural impact. Instead, what happened was Yorkshire Water and the Environment Agency and Hull City Council got together and said, could we not do this in a different way? And what they did was to create, I think there are 5 natural flood bowls, which for most of the year when Hull isn't flooded, look like parks or football pitches or golf courses or woodland or, natural areas. And it's been much cheaper. It's politically much more attractive. The public like it. It's much less disruption. And the end result is most of the year they have green spaces to walk their dogs in and play in and so on. It's been really, really effective. So since it's been in operation, Hull hasn't flooded, but also the kind of near misses they've had when they would have had to turn their pumping stations, they have 2 at the moment, up and running. They haven't had to use them at all. So, this is a different approach. And, Leeds is now doing the same thing. York City Council has bought several farms upstream from York. So rather than building a massive concrete wall around York and having all of that hard infrastructure, York has been trying to say, okay, well, if we create basically sponges upstream from York, when it does flood, the water can spread out across these farms or these natural areas. And, as with the example I gave in Hull, it's a much more beneficial, much lower carbon, much more ecologically friendly, much more publicly acceptable, much cheaper way of doing it. And so, those kind of approaches are proliferating now. There are more and more of them, and more, less and less of a inclination among civil engineers or planners to go for the hard concrete option first, and more openness to exploring these kind of green approaches instead.
It sounds like a very attractive idea. And Hazel's just pointing out in Pickering here, we've had a slow the flow exercise. And if you come across that, which again is all about that kind of working upstream and putting natural barriers in instead. So hopefully that makes sense, Dilys, but shout if you need some more explanation on that. Maybe a quick more point from David before we move on. David, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Okay, Andy, it sounds like you've got all sorts of stakeholders that you're working with there, from private sector and local authorities and so on. How much support have you had especially from those local authorities? I think you said 22 was it, or so local authorities in our area, and because obviously when we have our North Yorkshire Council eventually doing all singing, all dancing next year around, are you already getting indications from them that they will support your work? Because there's another plan that you'll be aware of, the North Yorkshire LEP as well, and I'm a little confused as to which plan is doing what, or which of the plans the local authorities are getting behind.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of political support in broad terms. So all of the local authorities, combined authorities, are involved in the work of the Commission. And a part of what we're doing is saying basically, austerity has hit local government pretty hard over the last 10 years. And their capacity to deliver on a massive agenda like climate change is quite restricted at times. And instead, what we're trying to say is, they play a key role, absolutely. And there are some areas like transport, housing, planning, where local authority involvement is absolutely crucial. But actually sharing responsibility out across the region to other organizations, other public organizations, other private actors, companies, and to communities is the right thing to do. And it both builds capacities for things to be done that couldn't perhaps be done otherwise, but also kind of mobilizes and hopefully energizes other people to get involved. And one of the first things we did was to collate a set of kind of success stories of all the good things that are happening across the region on climate change already, because lots of people felt that, no one was doing anything or not much was happening. And so if no one else is doing anything, why should I? Right. And we thought, well, that's just not true. It's all a bit invisible. And if we could bring it together and tell people what's happening and celebrate some of the successes, the aim was to, change the debate a little bit, to be a bit more positive and a bit less, negative, I suppose, or a bit more practical as well, to show that there was a lot of good stuff happening, but that we need to do much more and we need to scale it up and build on what is happening. But also to change the nature of the debate a little bit, at times, I think people rely on local authorities to do things or rely on government to do things, whether they can or not, whether they're willing to or not. And actually, by sharing responsibility and getting everybody else involved, we wanted to take some of the pressure off local government and say, everybody else is doing this too. And I think that's been really welcomed. But it works when there's consensus and when we can build consensus and everybody can get on board. And like the example I gave of flood management in Hull was a good example of that. But to be brutally honest, it doesn't always work. When there are really divisive issues, like the one that's had a massive impact on Leeds Climate Commission is airport expansion. There are some of us who believe that that's completely at odds with the climate agenda, but there are others who believe that it's necessary for job creation. We have 40,000 people unemployed in Leeds, and those people, it was easy for the environment movement to kind of demonize them and say that you're just anti-climate, you're a climate denier and all this kind of stuff. But actually talking to many of them, they're absolutely committed to social justice and inclusion and reducing fuel poverty and that kind of thing. And their agenda was just focused on that rather than on the climate. And I think in the climate movement, we sometimes forget that there are good people with other objectives doing good stuff. And what we hope the Commission will do is provide a safe space for sensible conversation on those really divisive issues. And maybe we won't always agree, and that and the Commission can't force a consensus through, especially when you've got a broad range of different actors with different views. But what we can do is take some of the heat out of the conversation, turn it into a more constructive debate, understand both sides of the argument, and hopefully find a better way forward. That's not to say there's no role for climate campaigning. Absolutely, they empower the Commission in many ways, but we are trying to be that kind of pragmatic, positive organization that seeks a consensus, if you like. And just that, I think, has helped to get some of the authorities on board as well and build political support. They really struggle to deal with what's a massive, overwhelming challenge, and hopefully the Commission is helping a little bit.
Excellent. Are you okay with that, David? Do you want to come back briefly, or is that see thumbs up there? So fantastic. Well, let's keep it going. I think you've got a little more to share with us, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more questions and discussion to come. But, thanks for the pause there, Andy. Okay.
So to zoom in on climate resilience, and I think we'll talk about the net zero bit in a bit more detail. Here we developed a few different actions. One was to develop better climate risk communications. And this is honestly quite a challenge at times. As I said, if you look at the forecasts for climate change and the impacts on the Humber region, then one of our challenges is how do we communicate those very real risks that are already happening and being borne out without scaring everybody to death and making us all a bit fatalistic. Our view is we need a positive way forward, as well as saying there's a massive risk here. We also need to have the beginnings of an answer and to enable people to get behind, answering that, or get behind the solutions. Part of that is around the adoption of climate adaptation plans. And we've been working with various councils to develop these plans. There used to be a statutory obligation for local authorities to have these plans until 2010, but then it's been abolished. And honestly, a lot of councils have net zero targets, but very few have meaningful adaptation plans. So we're helping a cluster of them to develop a best practice plan at the moment, and then hopefully that will be spread around the region. Also, to promote resilience actions that offer health and well-being benefits in flood-prone areas. There's real evidence that that risk and the anxiety about those risks, really does undermine people's well-being. So how do we address those, especially in, I'm sure we've all seen the floods in Hebden Bridge, for example, or the flood I mentioned in Hull, or York floods on a fairly regular basis. How do we build human resilience as well as physical resilience to that? Also, how do we restore and enhance the region's natural assets? So people like Yorkshire Water are, they're one of the biggest landowners in the region. They own a lot of farms and a lot of natural areas. They are changing the nature of their tenancy agreements to make sure we protect peatland management. One of the big risks, and this is a carbon risk as well as a flooding risk, is if peat dries out, it then basically releases the carbon that's stored in wet peat. And the scale of this is quite staggering, actually. Sorry, as an aside, we're writing a climate action plan for Derry and Strabane in Northern Ireland at the moment. And we've just been looking at their carbon footprint. And for them, the peatland, partly peat cutting for fuel and burning, but also just degradation and drying out of peat. Emissions for them from that are higher than their emissions from all their houses and all their transport combined. And we think the same is probably, well, maybe not quite that true, but peatland management is a big issue for Yorkshire. So Yorkshire Water and Natural England and others are doing a lot to address that. And, that's preventing carbon emissions and preventing flooding and enhancing nature at the same time. Also working with farmers and food and farming sector for future change and nature-based solutions and blue-green infrastructure we mentioned. Promoting climate resilience in business and industry. Lots of our businesses face huge disruptions at times, especially from flooding. But for the water company, for Yorkshire Water, they have to plan for massive storms and more intensive storms on the one hand, but also for potential droughts on the other. How do they do that? How do you balance, reservoirs and the need for extra water supply with the unreliable nature of weather and more flooding now? Developing climate readiness and resilience training. One of the things we found in Hull after the 2007 floods was that one of the biggest sources of disruption to people in their lives was teachers not being able to get to school. And so families not being able to send their kids to school. So maybe with COVID, we've learned a little bit more about digital and online connectivity and how to be resilient in that way. And that just highlights the interconnectivity of the whole thing. But it also highlights how we have to make our digital infrastructure more resilient so that it's not affected by flooding. And to support emergency and recovery planning when it takes place. There are some bonkers things still happening. Insurance companies, for example, insisting that flooded homes are restored or renovated to exactly the same standards as they were before the flood. Even if the electrical infrastructure was part of the reason why it flooded, why can insurance companies not require houses to be built back better so that they're more resilient in the future rather than just replacing the vulnerabilities that were there before? So also promoting affordable comprehensive flood insurance and strengthening plans for the long-term management of change and loss caused by sea level rise. All of those are big issues, and the Commission is working across all of them. Again, should I stop there and just take questions on climate resilience, or should I press on and do net zero? What do you think, Paul?
Maybe press on. I'm not seeing any questions relating to this specifically, so maybe we can take we go to the next step and then pause there, Andy.
Okay, yeah, sure. So one of the first things the Commission did was to survey all of the carbon reduction targets that have been adopted by local authorities across Yorkshire and Humber, and to see whether they were appropriate. Actually, when you look at them, I think a year ago, 21 of the 22 authorities had carbon reduction targets. Many of them were 2030 for net zero. Some of them were 2035 or 2038. Some were 2040. But when you add them all up, they do equate to, and they do enable the regions to stay within our carbon reduction budgets, basically. And so the region as a whole has now set itself a target of getting to net zero by 2038, but showing significant progress by 2030. Obviously, we can argue about whether those are ambitious enough, but we're almost halfway through 2022. Many of these targets were set in 2019 before COVID. We're a quarter of the decade through the time we have to deliver. Leeds, for example, has a net zero by 2030 target. Are we on track? Honestly, no, not really. Leeds, as one example, maybe the one I know best, is doing a lot. There's a very ambitious transport plan. There's a very £100 million retrofit scheme for public housing. There's a district heating scheme. The University of Leeds has just committed £160 million to reach net zero by 2034, I think it is. So there's a lot happening. But when you look at the numbers, our emissions are falling by perhaps 5% a year as a city, and they need to be falling by 11% a year if we're going to get to 2030, net zero in 2030. So, a lot of good things are happening, but not at the rate needed to get to net zero by 2030. Probably more in line with the goal of getting to net zero by 2038, which is still ahead of the national target, which is 2050. One of the things we said, though, was that we needed to include aviation and shipping in our carbon targets. So flying accounts for about 6% of our carbon footprint if you add it on to the normal carbon footprint for the region, and shipping about the same. And the Committee on Climate Change has recommended that at a national scale, we include flying and shipping in our carbon budgets, and that's happened, but we need to do that at a regional scale too. That can be quite controversial. We also introduced 5-yearly carbon budgets for the region. So not only having a kind of medium to long-term target, but also having a shorter-term target, because we wanted like an early warning system, really, to say, if we're not on track, we need to know sooner than later. And there needs to be real pressure on politicians in this cycle, rather than, kicking it a few elections down the road to future politicians maybe to answer. So we have now got these five-yearly carbon budgets in the action plan. And then the specific or more practical things. So to develop smart and flexible energy networks, the electrification of heating, if we switch from gas boilers to electric to ground source heating, for example, that will involve a big reduction in gas consumption, but a big increase in electricity consumption. And similarly, transport, if we electrify many of our vehicles, then that will also have a big impact on electricity. And so many of the forecasts are suggesting we need to perhaps double our electricity generation by 2038. So some of that is happening. The massive increase in offshore wind, which Yorkshire is a massive leader in. Genuinely, these are world-level success stories happening off the coast of Yorkshire. And that offshore wind will treble or quadruple by 2030. That's kind of locked in already. 40% of our electricity now comes from renewables, and by the end of the 2020s, that will be well over 50%. That creates other problems to do with energy storage. But this also means we have to upgrade our distribution, our grid system, basically. And rural areas, I think, face real constraints in that space. At times, so making sure we work with the energy networks to make sure that they proactively enable electric vehicles to grow in rural areas, for example, is a key aspect of what we're doing. And then supporting renewables and decarbonised energy supply. So solar farms are coming through at the moment. Ground source heating, community water-based heating. There's a major regeneration scheme in Leeds looking at heat recovery from the river air at the moment. And biofuels, bioenergy is also coming through. So there's a lot happening in this space. And then community energy also, instead of thinking about it either as big national schemes or as very local household level schemes, how can we promote community-based solutions? Some really interesting stuff going on around net zero villages at the moment, which I find particularly fascinating and obviously crucial. And then looking at things like green hydrogen. So when there's more wind blowing than we need at night, for example, can we use that to generate hydrogen, which can then be blended in with natural gas or stored as a fuel, or used for tractors or heavy goods vehicles, for example, as a fuel? I think there is a real role for green hydrogen. Carbon capture, utilization and storage. Drax Power Station, I guess many of you will know, they have 6 burners where they burn fuel. 5 of those, I think, are on biofuels already. Biofuels is quite a contentious area. Much of that fuel comes from plantations and forestry byproducts from North America. But Drax are also a leader in carbon capture technologies. And there's a major investment now in Teesside and in the Humber region to generate carbon capture, and fairly realistic propositions that it'll be on stream at a massive scale by the end of the 2020s. And then, that could enable the glass sector, the steel sector, to decarbonize as well. At the moment, they would face real challenges without CCUS. And then an ambitious regional retrofit scheme, even more important now with energy prices rocketing up so high. We need to make our homes more efficient. And there's a lot going on in that space, but maybe not as much national policy as we need to enable this to happen at the speed and the scale that we believe is necessary. And then on travel, to promote active travel, walking and cycling, public transport and low emissions vehicles. Again, the just transition argument or idea that I mentioned earlier, that includes rural areas, I guess, like much of Rydale. How do we make sure public transport or electric vehicles are available and viable in rural areas as well as in urban areas? In a way, half of my job that I was talking about, the infrastructure bank, is there to support that kind of thing to areas where mainstream investors may leave them till last at times. To support net zero businesses and infrastructure and net zero food and farming, to think about addressing aviation emissions. We are about to call for national government to adopt a national aviation strategy that looks at aviation in the round across the whole of the UK. I mean, basically, if they expand Heathrow, as has been proposed, then none of the other regions can expand their airports at all. So would you rather have a very London-centric, Big Bang approach, or would you rather manage demand and spread this around the UK a bit more evenly, and make sure that any expansion that there is, if there is any, is consistent with the 6th carbon budget, which is a big challenge. And then accelerate the adoption of nature-based solutions and promote a circular economy. A circular economy is where the goods, the materials and the energy in the economy, instead of it going through in a linear way and then out the other end of a pipe and into waste, for example, that you capture it and recycle it. And district heating is a good example of that. Leeds, as I said, has a big district heating scheme. It uses energy from waste to heat, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 houses now, including all of our tower blocks. And you want that to happen. But also sustainable consumption, the last one. When you look at how much we're over-consuming and how much waste we generate, and what the carbon impacts to other places are from our overconsumption of everything, then really we need to change consumer behavior as well. And that's a massive challenge. And that if we're honest, that's a bit of a blind spot in many carbon conversations. It's not only about big infrastructure and government policy, it's also about individual behavior change. It sounds like you're already doing a lot in that space within your group, which is wonderful. And that's it. Sorry, I talked a little bit too much.
Quite a list. Impressive stuff. We have got plenty of questions here. What I'll say to everybody is keep it up, put your questions in chat, or if you prefer, let me just stop the sharing the screen here. If everybody wants to go back to gallery view as well, go top right of your screen into the view button, and you can switch to gallery view, so you can see everybody if you prefer that kind of view. If you don't want to use the chat for questions, you use that little reactions button at the bottom there, and you'll see there's a raise hand button. So if you can't be bothered to type, basically, then raise your hand that way, and we'll try and bring you into the conversation. I'll stop the recording as well at this point, but fantastic presentation. Thanks for that, Andy.